people who are pushed to the margins of society, often for valid reasons.
Right.
And I think why, to me, Roy doesn't totally feel like an anti-hero is because he's depicted as being the moral center of the film.
Today we have Samm Deighan. Samm is a writer and film historian, and we're going to talk about High Sierra from 1941. I want to just kind of I want to point out some bulletin points, I guess, just to start off. So High Sierra is a 1941 film noir crime drama directed by Raoul Walsh. I'm just kind of going over this for our viewers or our listeners. Starring Humphrey, Bogart, and Ida Lupino, with a screenplay by John Huston and W.R. Burnett, which it's based on Burnett's novel, right? And it becomes a major turning point in Bogart's career. I think this is the film, I believe, that launched him into stardom.
Yeah, it's, I think, a really important film for Bogart and for John Huston, because the success of this allows the two of them to go on to make The Maltese Falcon right afterwards, which I might have to argue with you. I don't think this is film noir.
Okay.
And it exists in this really, kind of nebulous but fascinating zone from like 39 to 41 where you have these movies that are still kind of holding on to the 30s gangster films, which of course Burnett, like, that's what he's known for. And so I think maybe something about the story structure and the character reminds me so much more of those 30s gangster movies. And of course, when they started making film noir, they weren't like planning this is what we're going to do, creating this whole subgenre. So it's, I think, interesting to watch films like this that are kind of on this weird line that are leaning into what film noir will become, especially by like 44, 45. But it's just great to see Bogart finally given like a meatier role and not be on the sidelines. And he had to fight for it.
Okay, so could you talk a little bit about that, like the background?
Yeah, so originally they wanted Paul Mooney to star in this film, and he's also really closely associated with a lot of the 30s gangster movies, is very much of that type, and I think was sick of playing that type and turned down the film. And Bogart then was really good friends with John Huston. Like, they would go out drinking together, and so he saw the script and was like, this is for me. And he had worked with Raoul Walsh, I believe, but only in smaller roles. And so he kind of talked his way into getting this role. And I think the results speak for themselves.
Yeah. So, Humphrey Bogart went on to do The Maltese Falcon. Was it right after this one?
Yeah, it's also 41.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah.
So back to, if we could just backtrack for 1 second. I don't mean to split hairs about what's film noir and what's, crime drama of the era, but I was almost thinking of it as like proto-noir in a way, right? Like you said, it's not quite, it's still on the cusp of that like 1930s gangster thing. It's kind of like when one era spills into another. And I don't know, I was just thinking it reminds me of like, the birth of modernism or something, how it's not quite modernist yet for the first like 20 years because it's trying to kind of move and pivot into that new era, but it's not like, it hasn't come to fruition yet, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But I just thought this was such an interesting movie when I first watched it. It kind of blew me away. I think I saw it for the first time about a year ago, which, I'm sort of ashamed that I didn't see it sooner. But at the same time, it just stands out in my mind because I thought Humphrey Bogart was so good in this role. I thought it was something that really like propelled him in my mind of like, yes, I understand why people talk about him as a great actor, but this really solidified it for me, I felt like. And to me, I think it had to do with that sort of fatalism of his character, right? Like, he is trying to turn his life around. He's fresh out of prison as the movie starts, and then he's trying to go sort of straight, as they say, right? And then he just wants to pull off this one last bank heist. And I don't know. I think it even early on in the film, I felt like he's predetermined to go down this bad path again, right? You could just sort of feel it coming. And I was just sort of wondering, like, your take on how you kind of read the film and sort of the fatalism side of it.
So it's interesting because it's a film about a guy who is in prison, as you said, and as far as he knows, is spending the rest of his life there. And the only reason he gets out is because this basically gangster who seems to be kind of like a mentor figure for him bribed a governor to break him out of prison so that he could lead this heist. And there's all this really interesting stuff in there about how the younger generation is different in a negative way. Like, the younger guys who go on the heist with Bogart's character are just really like drunk and reckless and violent and jealous, and like they're distracted. They're not being professional. And so there's all this stuff in there about how this maybe older generation way of being a man and being a man outside the law is dying out. And I think that's also part of what makes it so interesting to me, as like coming at the end of that era of gangster movies and ahead of this new emerging crime trend that isn't fully formed yet. So it's like there's nowhere for his character to go.
Yeah.
I think the fatalism element was probably imposed by the Hays Code. Like, I can imagine a version of this film where they run away together and just go and like live on a farm somewhere with their money hidden.
Sure.
Because there's also a lot of interesting stuff, like you said, about him wanting to go straight. It's not really that he gets out of prison and says, I don't want to commit any more crimes. Like, he is obligated because of this gangster's generosity and efforts. He's obligated to go through with the heist, and it seems to be what he knows he's good at. But the way that it plays with his relationships with women, I think, says so much about what the character thinks about like domestic life and settling down, because it's almost like the inverse of the film noir movies to come with femme fatale characters. Like Ida Lupino, her character Marie, I think if this came out in a couple years, she would be a more typical femme fatale. Like, she's also basically a criminal. She's a dancer, a taxi dancer, gangster mall. But this movie positions her as like this loyal, wholesome character who will stick by him no matter what and eventually wins his love because of that. But for the first half of the film, maybe even more than that, he's in love with this kind of like milk-fed, wholesome country girl who is disfigured. She has a problem with her ankle, and the way he idealizes her as kind of this like innocent, perfect wife is revealed to just be a fantasy. And you don't really see movies saying things like that about men's fantasies of women and how that tracks with what women actually are as individuals and symbolically until later in the 40s. So I think it comes really early in terms of how it depicts his struggle with like settling down and getting married, and how being a husband or being like a male provider ties directly into his identity as a man.
Okay, yeah, no, I completely agree with that. In my notes, I kind of put that I read Ida Lupino's Marie Garson character as sympathetic and this emotionally complex female lead that breaks with that femme fatale. But the femme fatale wasn't really quite there yet, right? Because it was maybe a couple years after that.
Well, it's hard to say when they really begin. And the Hays Code, for anyone who's unfamiliar, the Hays Code basically snaps into place between 1934 and 1935. And it says a number of things about how you have to write a story and make a film and what kind of behavior is considered immoral. And one of the things that directors had to stick to is that if you commit a crime on screen, you have to be punished for it. So the character either has to die or go to prison.
Sure.
But I think by 41, there's a movie called I Wake Up Screaming that I absolutely love. It stars this guy, Laird Krieger, who incredible, underrated figure who sadly died young, but he's in a great series of like thrillers and emerging film noir movies. And there is a character like that who I think is sort of a femme fatale prototype. She's this very, I don't know, selfish, headstrong actress or aspiring actress who manipulates the men around her to get what she wants. She winds up getting murdered,
right?
Which, you know, can you give a spoiler for a movie that's almost 100 years old?
Yeah.
It happens quickly in the film. Like, a big part of the plot is figuring out who killed her. But I think she represents the beginning of this type of woman who doesn't want to fit into a neat role and doesn't want to have her life defined by marriage.
Yeah.
And I think you see it really take off by the mid-40s.
Okay. Yeah, and I agree with that. And thank you for the rundown on the Hays Code, because I was thinking some of our listeners or viewers might not know what the Hays Code is.
Yeah, with information like this, I have a hard time understanding how familiar people are. Like, I think if you like crime films and film noir and classic Hollywood, of course you know what the Hays Code is.
Yeah.
But if you're new to some of these films,
Sure.
I think it's really helpful in understanding why certain things like suicide almost never appear on screen in this period.
No, that's a great point. So, Sam, I was thinking about themes within this movie, and so we touched on the gangster era or the end of the gangster era. We've talked a little bit about fatalism. Next up, I was thinking about class and the American dream, and I thought this was kind of interesting. So Roy tries to help the disabled girl, Velma, who you talked about, and dreams of a better life, but society doesn't really make room for someone like him to reform, or that's what it seems like. And so, I don't know, is there like a classist element going on here in High Sierra, especially with sort of Velma and Roy?
Yeah, I think you could make a case that 98% of all crime films have to do at their core with class issues, because they're often about characters who don't have money who want it, or don't have power, or things adjacent to power like wealth and want them and can't get them by going through conventional social channels, so they have to go outside of society, outside of the law.
Right.
And I think gangster characters in the 1930s are so interesting because you tended to sympathize with them more. And I think this is a big part of why the Hays Code comes along, is in pre-code cinema and in those early gangster movies, you have these like heroic criminal characters and these really compelling, charismatic characters living outside the law in a variety of different ways. And I think there is this effort made in 1941, 1942 onwards to remove the characters outside of the law as heroes and protagonists and anti-heroes, and to find a way to make them seem patriotic. And I think a film like this says, this is a guy who's sympathetic because he's just like us.
Yeah.
He comes from a small town. He is in love with this small town girl and worships her grandparents, who are just like kind, you know, simple folk. And they're contrasted by people who live in LA and the city. And one of the most interesting things I think about this film is the fact that you could set a bank heist movie anywhere there's a bank. But this movie is set in what is basically, or what would have been in previous movies, the Old West. Except instead of the Old West being a place of freedom and lawlessness and expansion and like room for men to be men and, you know, go off exploring, it's LA. And there's all this stuff where he talks about being in the city, and like we see him interacting with people, and it's obviously a place of like wealth and status symbols. And it's interesting to see a Hollywood film kind of reacting against that. Like, he sees those people as fake, and he doesn't want to be associated with them. Yeah,
no, that's great. Yeah, that yes. Yeah, wow, I hadn't quite broken that down, but yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I feel like I was going to go in a different direction next, but you talked about the landscape, and so I feel like maybe that's a good segue for us to talk about the landscape in High Sierra, right?
Yeah.
So I described it as noir, then I kind of called it proto-noir because it feels like it's heading in that direction. But what about, I mean, to me, as I was watching this movie, I did sort of think about it as noir. I think whatever I was watching it on was listing it as that at the time.
And it usually is.
Yeah.
And like, I'm not trying to be,
of course.
difficult about it.
No.
And I think film noir is often so interesting to talk about because you have certain movies that I think are obviously indisputably film noir, but often what winds up being the most interesting to discuss are the films that come like at the beginning and the end of the cycle, because they're positioned in this place where the genre is changing and crime films are doing something different. And I think unlike a lot of other genres, it's murkier. Like it's really more of, to me, a discrete movement than a genre. Like I think traditionally it's 1940, 1941 to 1958 with Touch of Evil. Yeah. And then anything that comes after that is neo-noir. Yeah. And it's because it's doing something different. Yeah. And this is definitely at the beginning where you see this change, especially towards that fatalism.
Well, I wanted to touch on the landscape because I was thinking how, I had watched several film noir movies before this one, but what felt like a breath of fresh air when I was watching High Sierra is that landscape, and specifically the third act with the mountain range. And I just thought it was interesting because, you're so used to detectives or police officers chasing our protagonists through cities. I think about like The Asphalt Jungle or other films. And I don't know, just the landscape. It just felt so different. And I found myself more interested in it because it was different. And so late in the film, as Roy is retreating into the Sierras, I found this to be sort of like symbolic of like what he's trying to do.
Totally.
And so I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about like the symbolism of like the mountains or how he's retreating into the mountains.
Yeah, I think this is something that sets it apart from conventional film noir because it is not urban. Even though we do have these sequences in Los Angeles, I don't think any of them are at nighttime. So it's like these kind of visual signifiers that you're used to seeing are almost totally absent from this film. Like the actual heist scene, it's like a minute long.
Right.
Like it's clearly not the focus.
Right.
But the fact that the whole final act is him fleeing into the mountains, I think is so wonderful, and also is really what reminds me of Westerns, where there is a guy who wants freedom. He wants freedom from the law. He wants freedom from these really constricting social mores about, like you said earlier, retribution or the inability to find that. He's literally going into the wilderness to be free, but it's this really, the way it's shot, it's really kind of ominous. The way that they're kind of surrounding him on the mountain, which seems like it would be logistically impossible, but makes emotional sense in the film, and like shouting at him, and it echoes, and it starts to take on this kind of eerie quality. And I have to wonder if Treasure of the Sierra Madre was maybe inspired by it a little bit, because there's also a similar thing about Bogart going off into a mountain in search of essentially wealth, jewels, except Treasure of the Sierra Madre, for anyone who hasn't seen it, is basically like if you made a Western crime version of Lord of the Rings with Humphrey Bogart playing Gollum, because he loses it and he gets really like fixated on this treasure. And here he's not fixated on the money. He's fixated on being free, which I think is so important.
So I'm going to circle back to that in a second, but I don't know. I just, as I was rewatching this movie a couple days ago, I kept thinking about the mountain range for some reason. And not to go back to that again, but at the same time, I just feel like he's retreating into the mountains to avoid capture and avoid sort of like the standard responsibilities of a man at that age, I guess, and trying to get away from all of this. But at the same time, he dooms himself, right, by this inescapable mountain range. Like, they know that he can't really go too far, right, or he has to be on this mountain range. So I thought that was kind of interesting how, like, the mountains, I think, symbolize his freedom or trying to achieve freedom, but really he just ends up trapped and he's not able to escape that. And I thought that was really powerful, like the way that Raoul Walsh used mountain ranges as symbolism in the movie.
Oh, yeah. And the fact that there's all this great location shooting, it makes it feel very different than conventional film noir, which, again, very urban and very studio-based. And I think the mountains are interesting because they represent this kind of impossible freedom, this dream of freedom that can never become real.
Sure.
And you do see, I think, throughout cinema and television history, this character type or character trope of a man who has been imprisoned who will do anything to not be imprisoned again. Like, he is not going back to jail under any circumstances.
Right.
And I think part of what makes the ending feel so tragic is that Marie, Lupino's character, knows that that is the most important thing to him, and she values and respects that. And they try to convince her, you know, if you just talk him into coming down from the mountain, we won't hurt him. But she knows that going back to jail is worse than being killed. And she respects that and doesn't give him up. Yeah.
And, you know, like you said, it is tragic. It's, we're rooting for him, or at least I felt like I was rooting for him. I felt like he's this, I don't know if I would quite call him an anti-hero, but I guess he sort of is in a way, right? Like,
he doesn't feel like one, though.
Okay. Interesting.
Like, if you think about, to me, a classic anti-hero from around this period would be like Alan Ladd's character in This Gun for Hire.
Okay.
He is not a nice guy.
Yep.
He is a sociopath. And they make him sympathetic partly because of his romantic feelings for a female character and the way that he's protective of her. But he is someone who's an assassin. He is being paid to kill people. He has no moral qualms about that. He's sort of made his bed, lied in it. Whereas Bogart's character, Roy, gets upset when people describe him as a criminal. Like, when he sees these newspaper headlines, he doesn't see himself that way.
Yeah.
And when you look at the history of the way that bank robbers are depicted in movies and how that in the 70s and 80s kind of turns into or overlaps with how terrorists are shown in movies, I think you're seeing similar things about people who are pushed to the margins of society, often for valid reasons.
Right.
And I think why, to me, Roy doesn't totally feel like an anti-hero is because he's depicted as being the moral center of the film.
Okay.
Not somebody who's morally off to the side and is kind of drawn in or made likable, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. Yeah.
You feel bad for him. It's like he really just wants to do the right thing, and he didn't. I think the way he rationalizes it to himself, or at least this is my reading of it, he didn't set up this heist. He didn't ask to be let out of prison.
True.
He's just taking advantage of these circumstances that fate has provided him.
Yeah.
And he's not trying to do any more jobs after that. He wants to go live a quiet life. He's settling down with Marie. The only jewelry he keeps from this heist is an engagement ring to give her.
Yeah.
So it's like he's trying so hard.
That's a good point. So we've talked a lot about Humphrey Bogart as Roy, but I'm so interested in Ida Lupino's character as Marie and Velma. So just to kind of pivot for a second, I had this question for you thinking about the two women in Roy's life. Velma and Marie, as we mentioned, how do they function they kind of contrast each other, right? And so I was thinking about what do they reveal about Roy's sort of life and desires, you think? Because we have sort of like Velma, who has the issue with her ankle, and Marie, who's in love with Roy, but Roy still seems more fixated on Velma, but then you also get this feeling like he's gonna end up with Marie. And so I felt like there was this kind of ping pong back and forth as I was watching it of like, who is he going to choose, or one of them going to make some kind of move and that's going to alter the direction of the plot? Or I don't know. So I was just curious. We've talked a lot about our male protagonists, but what about the women in the film? Like, what does this all sort of mean for you, I think?
I think it says so much about the American dream in a way, and also values around the roles of women and marriage and things like that, because like I said a little while ago, I think it prefigures that same dichotomy within film noir in a really interesting way, because classic film noir, so many of the movies have a female character who's this kind of virginal, devoted wife who sacrifices her desires and her personality to just be a wife and mother. And then you have the femme fatale character who says, I'm not doing any of that. Like, all of this can go to hell. I'm going to do whatever I want. And because of the culture in which the films were made, she has to be painted as a villain in some way. And usually she's punished in some way too. But the male protagonist often struggles with wanting to be in love with his wife, but he's really attracted and drawn to this other woman and this kind of liberated sexuality that she represents. And I think in this film, you have this guy who's being presented with a woman who is intelligent, capable, loyal. She's smarter than any of the other men in the movie. She has a really high degree of emotional intelligence. Like, she's an incredible character, especially for a 1941 film. And he's not interested in her at first because I think the unspoken assumption is because she's been with other men. She's a taxi dancer. She doesn't come from some kind of wholesome background. And she's associated with this life of crime. And what he wants in his idealized vision of the world is somebody who comes from a farm or a small town and is a good girl. And he thinks that's what Velma is. And the midpoint of the film is when they switch this dynamic, and he pays for Velma to get surgery so that she can walk normally again. And as soon as she goes through the surgery, her real personality emerges and he can see her for who she really is. And all she's concerned with is looking pretty and dancing and all these things associated with female sexuality and also vanity. I think, like, she's not a very likable character. And it's interesting to see how the movie sort of says, well, you have this picture that you've painted in your head about how marriage and relationships should be and about how, like, a straight life should be. And the fact that he has such a happy relationship with Marie, that's shown to be also a very healthy relationship, even though they're criminals on the run. They communicate, they're kind to each other. It's interesting to see a movie that kind of criticizes this dream of what the American family should be, like, this early.
And can we talk a little bit about Ida Lupino? So she's an actress that I have only seen maybe in a couple roles, if I'm being honest. And I was just wondering, what do you think of her performance in this movie? I mean, to me, she's still like a newer actress. I'm still diving into her filmography. And so, I don't know. I was just wondering, like, are there any other sort of films that stand out to you that maybe our listeners or viewers might want to check out if they're into her performance in this film?
So I love Ida Lupino. I think she is one of the great talents of this era. She's also the only woman to ever direct a classic period film noir with The Hitcher, which is an extremely grim, bleak film that I highly recommend watching, especially if your idea of women directing films means films about women's domestic lives. It's like, this is a film that I don't think has a single female character. It's about men who want to murder each other. It's really wonderful. But her roles as an actor, I would say a good follow-up to this performance would be Fritz Lang's While the City Sleeps, which is a much more traditional film noir. It's also a crossover serial killer film, which is one of his specialties. And he's definitely one of the directors who helped create film noir, which I think happens the way that it does because of this really interesting blend of European directors coming to Hollywood. Some of them came over because they wanted to, but many were driven by World War II, Lang being one of them. And her performance in While the City Sleeps is amazing. It's this really just brutal look at the way that media is connected to violence, and especially violence against women. Because as I said, it's a serial killer film, and it's about this newsroom led by Dana Andrews as this reporter. Ida Lupino also works there, and you get the sense that she's been fighting her whole career to be taken seriously. And what they do to increase ratings is they taunt this serial killer and try to get him to commit more crimes to expose himself. And then they realize, oh wait, that's actually a horrible strategy that's going to get more people killed. And it's a genius film that I think feels unfortunately still pretty relevant to the way that media sensationalizes violence, but she's amazing in it. And her role is even more complex than I think in High Sierra.
Interesting. Okay, so is that film, is it ahead of its time in the way that it, not to focus on the violence against women, but it sounds like it is sort of ahead of its time in the way that it's kind of portraying that? Because I'm just thinking for the time and the era, I'm thinking about movies that would portray violence against women, and I'm not sure.
There are a lot of them.
There are. Yeah.
So I think the ultimate answer is yes, because Fritz Lang is someone who created or helped create a number of genres: fantasy films, science fiction, evil criminal mastermind movies through his Dr. Mabuse films, just like so incredibly influential for easily the first 20 years of his career. And he arguably created the modern serial killer film with M, which he made in 1931, and did all this crazy research where, because of the state of cinema at the time, because it was so different, he was just like allowed to go to the state prison and interview serial killers and put a lot of that information into the film. And While the City Sleeps is also based on a real life case. And so I think when you see someone like Lang, who's innovating with the visual world of the film, but also clearly like is invested in making crime films, but doesn't want to repeat himself, but also starts to look at the causes for real life violence, like almost all of his movies, or a great number of them, question how seemingly average people are driven to violence. Like a lot of his film noir movies, like Human Desire, this really great one that he made with Gloria Graham.
Yeah, I love that
Her
movie.
character is incredible.
Yeah, that's a great movie. So we've talked a little bit about Ida Lupino's other movies. Something we do on the podcast is just to kind of like talk and riff on other films that are sort of around this genre, or other films that people can check out. So we've talked a little bit about Ida Lupino, but what about Humphrey Bogart? I mean, obviously we know him from certain films that he's well known for, but what sort of comes to mind when you think about Humphrey Bogart? Like what should we be looking out for?
Humphrey Bogart is one of those fascinating figures that has left such a towering reputation and influence that I think people who haven't seen his films, or maybe they've just seen Casablanca, still know who he is.
Yeah.
And it's funny because John Huston talks about how when Bogart was coming up in Hollywood and was trying to break into bigger roles, no one really took him seriously because he wasn't a very physically imposing guy until you got him behind the camera. And then he has this kind of charisma that it just fills the screen regardless of what kind of movie he's in. And around this period, I think he does sort of get typecast in crime films and obviously was attracted to those roles, but things like Key Largo and Dark Passage. You have all these movies where he plays either anti-heroes or these kind of... He almost created this like special category for himself of these sorts of Roy-type characters, or like Rick from Casablanca,
right,
where Rick is not an anti-hero, but in the first half or more of the film, he's positioned himself as being this kind of morally gray character who just doesn't want to get involved. He doesn't want to pick a side.
Yeah.
And I think he's really good at existing in these kind of nebulous zones where you're not sure what to make of his character. Like, are we supposed to side with him or not?
Yeah, he does seem like someone who... I completely agree with that. And I know he has like a certain feel to him when you're watching him on screen. And I guess that does break down to what kind of roles he was selecting at the time, or what was presented to him for potential roles. Dark Passage. I love that movie.
It's so good.
Yeah, it's so good. I'm glad you mentioned that. What is the Nicholas Ray movie?
I was just going to say, what's the Nicholas Ray movie? It's his greatest role. It's better than Casablanca.
Is it In a Lonely Place?
Yes, it's In a Lonely Place.
Oh, what a great movie. Okay, I'm glad we were touching on all this.
Yes, also another really great example of how you can find complex women's performances in 40s films and 50s films and film noir. Again, Gloria Graham. She and Ida Lupino, I think, are two of the best from the period.
Funny. It's really funny that you mentioned Human Desire. I was just thinking about that the other day, and I thought, that is such a good movie.
It's so
and
underrated.
Gloria Graham is amazing in that.
But In a Lonely Place is special.
Yeah, that might be his best role. I really like him in Dark Passage for some reason.
It's good.
It's just one that I go back to. I think I watched it with my grandma when I was like 12, and it's just a movie that I keep going back to over the years. You know,
that was my introduction to both Orson Welles and Humphrey Bogart. It was my grandmother
cool.
Let's put on Turner Classic Movies, and she would tell me who people were, and maybe she hadn't seen the movie or didn't remember it, but knew which actors she loved, and Bogart was one of them.
Sure.
So we watched a lot of his movies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we've talked about Ida Lupino, we've talked about Humphrey Bogart. What about Raoul Walsh? Like, for listeners and viewers, once again, more recommendations. Are there other films by Raoul Walsh that you would recommend if they happen to like High Sierra, or they listen to this and they want to come check it out?
So Raoul Walsh is, I think, a really instrumental figure in early Hollywood. He started directing in silent cinema. He also acted in silent cinema. And he's someone who made films in these kinds of stereotypical, like, masculine genres, like movies that were geared towards mostly male audiences, like crime films and westerns and adventure movies. If you want something that's more... I don't know, maybe different from what he usually did, Thief of Baghdad, gorgeous film. If you like this, and the way, this being High Sierra, and the way it kind of transitions from 30s crime films to 40s, he made a couple in this like short period. He made The Roaring Twenties, which feels very much like a 30s gangster movie, and I think if you watch The Roaring Twenties and High Sierra, you can see the progression even more clearly.
Yeah.
He also made this great movie with Ida Lupino called They Drive by Night. And They Drive by Night, I think, is another perfect example of this transition point where it is kind of a heist criminal movie with figures that feel like they belong in a 30s film. So it's often lumped in with film noir, but I don't think it's quite there yet.
Yeah.
And she's great in it too. Also, the classic would be White Heat.
Yeah, I was gonna say I was hoping you were gonna name White Heat. I was like, we've got to talk about that.
It's the greatest. So White Heat, I think, is confusing in some ways because it's a 1949 film, but it feels like it should be made in 1939.
Yeah,
like it's a 30s gangster movie that comes so late that Cagney is able to deliver one of the greatest anti-hero performance. Like, would you even call him an anti-hero? He's a maniac.
Yeah.
He's the protagonist.
I'd have to rewatch it. It's been a while since I've seen White Heat, but the last time I watched it was probably a couple of years ago. But great movie,
perfect film.
It is. It's one that stands out in my mind when I think about this. And you were talking about the timeline of film noir. So you said it's about 1940.
Most people
42?
think so. If you look at like traditional lists from scholars and academics, a lot of people list The Maltese Falcon as the first official film noir, but I think it has a lot of elements and definitely is a wonderful film that I highly recommend people check out. Lots of overlaps in terms of cast and themes with Casablanca. But there's this 1940 movie called Stranger on the Third Floor that I'm obsessed with that stars Peter Lorre, except he's highest billed, but he's not in the movie for very long. And there are so many things happening in this movie that make it feel like it should have been made in 1945 that I think that's the first official film noir.
Okay.
It's basically about this guy living, again, lots of class issues, about this guy living in New York City in this like rundown apartment complex, and he gets framed for murder, but it's actually his upstairs neighbor who's the murderer, played by Peter Lorre in an extremely creepy performance. And also very nuanced. Like, he gets to deliver a speech towards the end of the film about like why he's driven to crime and how like life has twisted him this way. But it has this incredible surreal dream sequence where he imagines the actual protagonist. He imagines being arrested and sent to this kind of like underworld courthouse. And so the paranoid dream sequence elements, you see those in later film noir movies, and to see it so early. And there's all this stuff in there about persecution and threatened masculinity. So I feel like 40, 41, and I'm sure I've seen a lot of film noir movies, but I'm sure there are some other early examples I haven't seen yet.
Okay. And then I was just trying to think about White Heat and where we sort of place that. I mean, obviously it's still film noir, but...
because it's 41, I feel like... Because it's 49, I feel like you have to call it film noir. And it doesn't... It does things differently than the 30s gangster movies, but I think it's sort of saying in some interesting ways, because Raoul Walsh is all about how masculinity is changing in American society. Like, you can chart it throughout his films because he's looking at all these westerns and adventure movies and certainly war films as we get into the 40s. But it's almost like he's saying you can't, in this current world that we live in, be one of these 1930s gangsters anymore. These 1930s gangsters were often figures who, in classic organized crime in film portrayals, sometimes they're shown as being guys who care about their communities and guys who are held back from taking that straightforward, socially approved path because they're immigrants, because they grew up in blue-collar neighborhoods and didn't have certain opportunities offered to them. Like, the 30s movies are pretty upfront about showing the extreme wealth divide issues in America. Lots of parallels to right now. But I think White Heat says this type of idealized hero gangster doesn't exist anymore, and now we just have these psychopaths. Why can I not think of the main actor from White Heat? Cagney? Yes. Oh God, he's another one who is, I mean, I think every single film I've seen him in, it's like that is acting. My day job basically is I do film commentaries and like for Blu-ray releases, and the way I kind of got into commentaries was, I would buy a DVD, or I guess really it was just DVD when I was getting into it. I would start listening to commentary tracks, and I don't know how I came across this track, but there's this, I forget his name. There's an academic who did a track on Yankee Doodle Dandy, which is this incredible James Cagney musical. And it's my favorite commentary track of all time, which makes no sense because, like, I don't cover musicals very often. I don't cover that kind of big budget Hollywood film too much in my work. But the way he talks about Cagney and all the things that Cagney was able to do through his performances, incredible.
That is incredible. So, Sam, since we're talking about your work, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it is you do? I mean, we know that you're a writer. You had mentioned that you do a little programming. Could you give us a little bit about what you do in film?
Sure. It's hard to summarize. I guess my official title usually is that I'm a film historian. I've written and edited a couple books. I did one called The Legacy of World War II in European art house cinema that came out a couple years ago. My most recent book, which I co-wrote and co-edited, is called Revolution in 35mm. It's all about depictions of political violence in cinema, and it's an anthology collection with essays covering films from all over the world made during the years of the Cold War. So like between 1955 and like 1990.
Okay.
I work as a special features producer for Vinegar Syndrome. I work for a lot of other Blu-ray companies. Like I do work for Criterion. My most recent thing for them is a commentary on Ken Russell's Altered States, which will be out this October.
Awesome.
I have a podcast called Eros Plus Massacre and another one I just started called Perverse Permission that are both more focused on East Asian cinema and like cult cinema.
Oh, okay.
I feel like that's most of it.
That's really cool. Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
We showed Altered States here last year, and just what a movie. I mean, just incredible.
William Hurt,
yeah.
Speaking of incredible performances,
yeah,
so physically demanding. He's amazing in it.
Yeah, he is amazing in it. Can I ask, what's your favorite Ken Russell? I mean, now that you mentioned him, I feel like I have to ask that question.
My favorite Ken Russell... Well, the movie that got me into Ken Russell was The Devils, so part of me feels just like obligated to say that. At this point, I think if I had at gunpoint to pick a favorite Russell film, it would maybe be Mahler.
Interesting. Okay.
His work doing biographical films on composers and artists, I think, is some of his most underrated work. Almost all of it's amazing, but Mahler is something special.
Okay, I was going to say The Devils too. That's, I don't know, it's just the one that always gets me. It stands out in my mind. Or Altered States. I love that one too.
And I think I've seen people try to argue that because Altered States is science fiction, it's not really typical Ken Russell. It's really more of a Paddy Chayefsky film. Of course, Chayefsky wrote the script and the novel sort of right around the same time. But to me, it does feel like a Ken Russell film. It's got all of these elements about kind of religious ecstasy and the burden of genius and just the most incredible visuals, like the hallucination sequences. Some of the craziest
cinema I've ever seen.
I know.
So to circle back to High Sierra for a minute, where does this rank for you? I guess, among film noir, proto-noir, like where does this sort of rank for you? Is this a great film noir? Is this a masterpiece? Is this an okay film? Like how do you think of High Sierra when you think about it?
So High Sierra is definitely not one of my favorites compared to like the larger body of film noir, but I don't know. There's something about it that I think continues to be really fascinating because of Bogart's performance and Lupino's performance, because of the way that it spends most of its time focusing on the dynamics between these characters who are often kind of in confined spaces.
Yeah.
And also just the ending is incredible.
Yeah. So what about Pard in the film?
What a ridiculous element.
Yeah. I think about him like sitting up in the chair in like that corner scene where Humphrey's, and I don't know, it's just such a funny dog, and I grew up with a dog like that. So every time I rewatch High Sierra, I always think of that.
It's such a strange element. And I think it may have been less strange at the time because you do see a lot of 40s movies where they include these kind of what you could think of as like conventional family dynamic tropes. Often dogs are involved. If people live on a farm, it's a horse.
Yeah.
So this is not the only 40s movie where a dog has an unexpectedly large role. And of course, by the 50s, we get Lassie. And Lassie is all about stories about conventional family life through the lens of this dog. And I think that's what's going on here. So Pard is the first way that we see Roy's soft side. He cares for lost, abandoned things. And there's this, to me, kind of uncomfortable parallel drawn between Marie and the dog.
Oh, okay.
It's like he wants to take care of her. He wants to take care of this dog.
Yeah.
They're both sad and lonely, and they have nowhere else to go, and he can't abandon them.
And Velma, too, right?
Well, I think he sees Velma that way, but she's not really.
She's not really that way, but he does want to help her.
Yes.
So I think of it as like another way or another element that they're using to humanize Roy, right? And make him more likable. So,
But where it gets weird is in the last act. So they try to leave this dog, and I can't remember this character's name. I want to say that it's like Agamemnon or something amazing. There's a black character in the movie, which there are not a lot of interesting black characters in 40s cinema for the obvious reason of racism. But this character is pretty sympathetic, and like I want to say runs a gas station or something near the cabin where Roy is hiding out, and they try to leave the dog with him. The dog is having no parts of it and runs after them.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, but also kind of weird because it takes this sort of conventional crime plot and throws this family-friendly element into it. But the thing that I think is so bizarre, and I'm not sure what John Huston and Burnett were going for here, but in the second half of the film, Bogart starts to talk about the dog like he's cursed, like he's cursing things and things aren't working out the way they're supposed to be, and maybe it's because this dog keeps showing up. I think the implication is that if he was less empathetic and less caring and more of like a harder edged criminal, things would be working out better. But because he's standing in between these two worlds, this sort of, kind, conventional straight husband on one hand and this career criminal on the other, it's like he can't fit into either of these two worlds. Like he's too nice and it's getting him into trouble. And that's sort of what the dog signifies, but like the dog gets him killed at the end of the movie. We need justice for Pard. It's not Pard's fault.
Poor Pard. That's interesting. I feel like I need to see it again now just to pay attention just to Pard's scenes because
they're strange.
I don't think I was thinking about it that way, but that's interesting that you said later in the movie his demeanor towards Pard changes, and I guess I hadn't picked up on that when I watched it a couple days ago, but now I'm more curious to go back and watch it again.
There is this really interesting thing they do with his character where they suggest that a little bit through the dog, but mostly through Velma, I think they suggest that him being nice and the kindness being connected to this desire to live a conventional, lawful life is in some way slowing him down. And it's like he feels taken advantage of because he sees Velma for what she is after the surgery. And that's, I think, a pretty unusual element to this film. Like, often, even when you watch film noir movies, the criminal characters are usually not given complex emotional lives or motivations, but he is. It's very interesting.
That is interesting. I've got to go back and check it
I
again.
don't think Paul Mooney could have done it. Or it would be like a flatter sort of film. No offense to, the memory of Paul Mooney. Not that he cares what I have to say.
Interesting.
And I know I brought up This Gun for Hire earlier, but I do think it comes at the beginning of certain movies having characters that interrogate their own behavior, like male characters who interrogate their inclination towards crime and violence.
Yeah. Okay. So, Sam, once again, where can people find your work? Where can we find you?
You can find me on Instagram. My handle is boringly my name, just at Samm Deighan. I have a Patreon under the same name. I have a podcast, Arrows Plus Massacre, and another one called Perverse Permission. You can find both of them on Apple, Spotify, and through this website called Cinepunks. And I think my books, you can find most of them any online retailer. I also, since we're talking about crime films, I also wrote a monograph about Fritz Lang's M.
Okay. I love that movie.
It's the best.
It's so good. I was just thinking about how it's so far ahead of its time.
So far. It's crazy. Like,
yeah.
He's the first person to make a movie where the criminal is the protagonist and is sympathetic.
It feels modern. Like, when I go back and watch it, it's just amazing. Like, how is this movie this old, yet it feels like it was made today?
It's wild.
Yeah, he was so ahead of his time. And tell us the name of your most recent book, just so we can keep an eye out.
Revolution in 35mm.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Reel 1 was recorded at Open Stage Media Studios, directed and edited by Zeb Schmidt, and produced by Paul Kazee.